So as mentioned earlier, Dr. Lubilo gave a great overview of the community side of trophy hunting, this very contentious issue, but I'm going to talk in particular about the conservation and touch on the animal welfare side of it as well. And because this briefing today is targeted particularly at journalists, trophy hunting is a perfect media story. It has charismatic animals such as lions and rhinos and elephants at the heart, and they're obviously seen as the victims of it. It has villains, which are often seen as the evil trophy hunters coming in from abroad, and it has celebrities who amplify this and give it media coverage as well. And in short, it has a very simple, clear story, which lends itself very well to the media. So it talks about, rich, usually white, evil hunters coming to kill increasingly threatened species and driving them closer to extinction. So that is a really compelling narrative, and unsurprisingly, that tends to create lurid stories. It creates clickbait headlines, these very dramatic headlines and online links that people will click on. And really importantly to remember, it creates campaigns and donations. So a lot of organizations are raising money off this kind of very emotive campaigning, and that shouldn't be forgotten. But the reality of it is that it's a complex topic. And I think journalists in particular, this is all too often the case. There is a very simple answer to this, but it's often wrong. And the complicated answer is often the right one. And poor journalism on this topic and poor media coverage could really lead to real world harms. We've heard about the impacts that bans could lead in terms of undermining food security and economic security of these communities affected. And it could also lead to really intense harms for conservation and to animal welfare. And I'm going to be going through some of those today. So I thought it was important to look at some of the most common misconceptions and false statements that we hear in the media around this topic. One of the first issues is that people often confuse trophy hunting with canned hunting, with poaching, with illegal wildlife trade. So there's real confusion about what trophy hunting even is. There's also these statements that frequently drive the narrative that we see in the media. For example, that trophy hunting is driving species to extinction, that trophy hunting puts pressure on populations by removing the best genes and the best animals, that trophy hunting has no major conservation benefit, that any benefits of trophy hunting could be replaced by phototourism, and that trophy hunting bans will improve conservation and animal welfare outcomes. So to start, we should clarify what trophy hunting really is. And this is the legal, regulated hunting of wild animals with specific desired characteristics, such as large antlers, for example, or we heard there about the horns on the buffalo, which overlaps with widely practiced hunting for meat. So it's quite a complicated scenario. It's not a simplistic thing, because often somebody going out and killing, say, a white-tailed deer and eating the meat and then keeping the rack of the deer, then that also falls under trophy hunting. So it's not just happening in Africa, it happens all across the world. And it's not poaching or illegal wildlife trade. It's very important to note that it is legal and regulated. And although most of the media attention does focus on Africa, it does occur across the globe, including, for instance, in the UK. It's very notable that the UK, in the most recent iteration of the Animals Abroad Bill, is not suggesting that they ban trophy hunting in the UK, although I believe that the number of animals trophy hunted here is far higher than the number of animals that get imported. So this clearly isn't about the morality of trophy hunting. This must be something to do with them feeling it drives the decline of these species abroad. But actually, if you look at the majority of animals hunted, for instance, from the Humane Society US report, we're actually ducks and geese. So it isn't actually usually involving these charismatic megafauna. Also important to note that canned hunting is different from the wild trophy hunting that I'm discussing here. Canned hunting, again, poorly defined, but is the hunting of animals in often captive bred in small fenced enclosures. And groups like IUCN and others take, rightfully, I think, a stand against it. But I'm going to be talking about wild trophy hunting. So I'm going to look at these points one by one fairly briefly. So first of all, is trophy hunting driving species to extinction? Now, we are right in the middle of an analysis right now. Currently, we've examined over 80 species, including all the top trophy hunted species in that HSI report, the big five, the traditional African sort of hunted species, the most hunted African species, most endangered species on the red list. And so far, we haven't found one where trophy hunting is a key current threat at a species level. But we have found several where it's actually a benefit, such as with rhinos. And rather than trophy hunting, it's really clear that the threats primarily driving species decline are habitat loss, poaching, and human-wildlife conflict. This is one example of lion threats to lions from a recent paper. And you see that trophy hunting comes down here as nearly the last threat, far, far below things like human-lion conflict and the impacts of things like bushmeat poaching. So in short, it doesn't drive decline. It doesn't drive extinction. We can see no evidence for that. But does it increase pressure, for instance, by removing the best genes or the best animals? And this is another common thread in the media narrative. So this study got a lot of attention, saying, trophy hunting removes good genes and raises extinction risk. And it's true that trophy hunting can be a pressure for some populations, particularly in infanticidal species, where if you're taking younger males and you don't have enough young cubs, for example, to get up to independence, then you can have a cycle where you don't have enough recruitment, enough sort of surviving young cubs to maintain the populations well. So this can be a real pressure for things like lions and for leopards in some populations if the quotas are either too high or the males being taken are too young. So it's very important there to have age-based regulations. There is also limited evidence of some negative selection on species like bighorn sheep, where if there's very intense hunting, that can lead to things like smaller horn size over time. But it's really, really critical to notice that trophy hunting usually targets older males. And in those cases, the genes have already been passed on. So it's not true that those genes are disappearing from the population. If the age-based regulations are followed, then that should be the case, that it shouldn't remove those genes. The genes are already passed on. And this is really reflected in the study that gets all the media attention. They clearly say that the scientists themselves said age restrictions that allow males to breed before being removed could reduce the impact of trophy hunting. It's already recommended with species like lions. And the lead author said, when it's properly regulated, trophy hunting can be a powerful force for conservation, which is why in that study, they're suggesting a different management approach rather than calling for a ban. So very important that the nuance again is addressed, and that was in a BBC coverage of it. So moving on, does trophy hunting have any major conservation benefits? And this is an unequivocal yes, I think. Land conversion is the primary threat to biodiversity globally. And trophy hunting zones have the same key benefit as national parks in that they protect wild habitat. It's very hard to keep up to date with these maps. This is a slightly outdated map now, but this is looking at where lion trophy hunting was legal and not legal, and looking at the range of national parks. And it was clear that more lion range, this is true now, is covered by trophy hunting zones than by national parks. So it's a major conservation benefit, and decisions affecting that land use should be taken carefully and with the full participation of local decision makers, so not imposed externally. And just like phototourism, trophy hunting helps protect habitat and fund conservation. If you ask most people why are national parks important, they would say, well, they protect habitat. The revenue from tourists coming in provides an incentive to keep the habitat. And that's exactly the same for hunting tourism. So they fund game guards, and therefore it incentivizes. You can see on the right here, this is a trophy hunting area. You can see that natural habitat right against it. This isn't even a fence. This is the natural boundary, goes straight into farmland where there isn't here an incentive to have a wildlife-based land use. And this is an example, again, slightly outdated maps here because there's been some change here with Nyeri National Park. But in general, this was looking at protected areas in Tanzania, a huge amount of protected areas across the country. And a lot of these light green areas are where the trophy hunting is permitted, whereas the dark green areas are the national parks. And if you look at the major threat of land conversions, this is agricultural land conversion in Tanzania. It's shown here by the red. You would know without knowing anything else that if you look at all these spaces, there's something going on there that is protecting against land conversion, that huge threat for biodiversity. So really important to maintain those big wild areas. And also important to note, the hunting zones protect far more than just the hunted species. We looked at 18 species in Tanzania, including things like the endangered African wild dog, and actually the majority of its range occurred in hunting protected areas rather than in non-hunting protected areas or even outside protected areas. So really important to note this has a wider biodiversity impact. And it can be positive counterintuitively for many, even for species conservation that are hunted themselves. This has been seen, for instance, with the argali in Mongolia. Things like rhino, that's some of the best examples of this in places like South Africa and Namibia. So both black and white rhino have shown increases with limited regulated trophy hunting. And even for species like lions, you have places like Bubi Valley Conservancy, where the lion numbers have increased substantially in what used to be farmland, again, with using revenue from tightly controlled trophy hunting. Really important to note that it's not black and white. It all depends. The impact of trophy hunting will always depend on the context and the management, and the impact on species and communities will depend on that context. But in general, it's proven that it can absolutely have conservation benefits, including that massive protection of habitat. So could those benefits be replaced by phototourism? Unfortunately, the short answer is no. We did an analysis that looked at the current funding of just protected areas with lions in them across Africa, using all the existing funding streams: phototourism, trophy hunting, donor aid, and state funding, all combined, and found that more than 90%, or around 90% of the protected areas were very underfunded. And so this is, all the red here shows the countries where over 90% of the need is underfunded, and this is with the current, all of those active revenue streams. If you take away trophy hunting as one of those revenue streams without replacing it with something better, you're going to make the situation worse, not better. So it's clear that phototourism cannot already fund even existing national parks well. And so it's not going to be able to fund more than double that area. It's just economically not going to be viable. And it's really important to note that it's not trophy hunting itself that is vital, but it is the conservation incentive to maintain land as natural habitat rather than converting it, for example, into farmland. And there is no clear viable alternative that currently exists at scale. There are interesting new ideas and innovatives like lion carbon, for instance, premium carbon credits that we help develop with biocarbon partners. This is looking at how to make lion habitat in this case more valuable and get additional revenue in. There are also things like wildlife bonds that could directly incentivize conservation. But these are all small scale ideas at the moment. They haven't been scaled up. They are not ready to replace trophy hunting at scale. And critically, as was touched on in the earlier presentation, they cannot be imposed from outside. If people choose to use these, then that should be their choice, often as an additive revenue stream rather than replacing existing ones. So really, would bans improve conservation and welfare? This is the dominant narrative. And we've certainly found from our study data down in southern Tanzania, we looked at both vacant hunting blocks where there was no management of the hunting blocks anymore. This is the kind of thing that will happen with increased bans if hunting becomes less economically viable, with active hunting blocks over here. And we found the probability of illegal human use was much higher in vacant hunting blocks. And this is unsurprising because, as Dr. Lublo talked about, there isn't then the funding for things like anti-poaching patrols and the resourcing of that effort. So you have more illegal use. This is likely to lead to more poaching, to more habitat conversion, and will intensify those far greater threats, such as habitat loss. And it really comes down to the fact that if wildlife does not have economic value to people that exceeds its costs, then it will be removed. And we see this extensively. We see this extensively particularly with human-wildlife conflict. These are all images of wildlife on village land where they've been killed because they don't have sufficient revenue. And this huge threat is not covered nearly well enough by the media. And it affects, in our area, it affected between 50 to 100 times more animals than would have been legally allowed to be killed if it was a trophy hunting area. So this is the kind of killing that really, really drives wildlife decline. And particularly those killings are much worse for welfare. They are often poisonings, they're snarings, the animals take days to die sometimes, and they're much worse for conservation because it doesn't take away the older males. Or for almost all species, removing older males has less impact than removing younger males or adult females. Adult females is a huge driver of population decline. And for many of the animals that we encounter that have been killed, say in conflict killing, they are adult females and often heavily pregnant. This lion had 3 cubs ready to be born. And this is just devastating for a population. And if anything, there is a media story here, but I think the media story should be much more about warning that this is big government policy being driven largely by misinformation. So, for example, there is a recent committee that occurred in the House of Commons, and there was clear misinformation being given, talking about trophy hunting certainly being a driving factor of wildlife decline, and in some cases the dominant factor. Like, we cannot find the evidence that backs these things up. Another statement, today the total population of rhinos in Africa is 1,300. We know that's not true. And yet these are statements that go in there and inform policy. And these were stated by people who are actually driving a lot of these campaigns to ban trophy hunting. And again, to remember that those people are getting donations and getting funding off this policy. So it's not without another agenda. And ultimately, we need much more nuanced journalism showing the complexity of this topic. We see it to some extent when responsible journalists look into this, they tend to reflect the fact that it is much more nuanced. But unfortunately, this tends to be drowned out by the tabloid journalists and that simplistic narrative that gets the clickbait, gets the donations, and gets people feeling outraged. But unfortunately, what it leads to is bans that could have a far worse impact for both wildlife welfare and for conservation. Thank you very much.